The wall had been there for 35 years. It was a plaster interior wall on the second floor of a row house in Callaway, Pennsylvania, painted over 4 times since 1988, and unremarkable in every way except for what was inside it. The renovation crew discovered it on a Tuesday morning in October 2023, when a crowbar opened a section of lath and plaster that had been sealed during a remodel of the original structure sometime in the late 1980s. Inside the cavity, between 2 studs, there was a small space, the kind of gap that settles into older walls and becomes a pocket. And inside that pocket, resting against the interior of the plaster as if it had been placed carefully rather than fallen, was a cloth doll. 12 inches tall, dressed in a yellow pinafore, with a button face that had faded to pale smears. The renovation foreman, a man named Paul Greer, stopped the work immediately. He did not know why exactly. He said later that it was the way it was sitting, upright, deliberate, like someone had made a decision about where to put it. He called the Callaway Police Department. The responding officer called Detective Sergeant Nora Vance. And Nora Vance, who had been with the department for 19 years, and who had a particular, stubborn relationship with one specific cold case file, looked at the doll in its evidence bag and said a name she had not said out loud in a long time. That is not a story about a doll. That is a story about what a 6-year-old girl had with her the last morning anyone saw her, and about the man who sealed her memory inside that wall and went on living as a neighbor for 35 years. But before we get to that Tuesday morning in October, we have to go back to 1988. Because to understand what that doll meant, you first have to understand who Lily Marsh was. Callaway, Pennsylvania in 1988 was the kind of small city that the 1970s and early 1980s had not been kind to. It sat in the western part of the state, in the region where steel and coal had once organized everything. The work schedules, the neighborhood borders, the particular pride that comes from making things. And by 1988, those industries had contracted enough that the city was still adjusting to what was left. Population around 22,000. Row houses on streets named after Pennsylvania counties. A main street that still had a hardware store and a diner and a pharmacy, but whose storefronts had gaps in them now, empty windows where businesses had closed and new ones hadn't arrived. The families who had stayed were the families of people who worked at the county hospital, the school district, the remaining light manufacturing plants along the river. They were not wealthy families. They were families that knew how to hold on. And they did. The Marsh family lived on Fayette Street in the north end of the city, in a row house that Clara Marsh had moved into in 1982 after her divorce, when Lily was 1 year old. Clara worked the morning shift at the county hospital as a dietary aide, which meant she was at work by 5:15 and home by 1:30 in the afternoon. Her neighbor, a retired school teacher named Edna Kowalski, who lived in the adjacent house and who had, over 6 years, become something close to a second grandmother to Lily, took Lily to school on the mornings Clara worked and collected her in the afternoons when Clara's shift ran late. It was an arrangement built from trust and proximity, the kind that only works when the people involved have been paying attention to each other for long enough to know they can rely on the result. Edna Kowalski was 71 years old. She had been doing this for 3 years without a single missed morning or afternoon. Lily Marsh was 6 years old and in the first grade at Callaway Elementary School on Jefferson Street. She had her mother's dark hair and, according to Edna Kowalski, her mother's exact expression when she was concentrating on something. A particular compression of the mouth and a slight forward lean that Edna recognized across 20 feet of yard without needing to see her face clearly. She was a child who was passionate about exactly 2 things: dinosaurs specifically the Brachiosaurus, about which she had facts she shared with anyone who would hold still long enough to hear them, and her cloth doll, which she had named Pearl, and which she carried with her to school inside her backpack every single day. Her teacher, Mrs. Renee Halston, had noted in a parent conference that Lily was the kind of child who was serious in the best way. Attentive, curious, careful with her work. She had told Clara that Lily was going to be fine, and Clara had cried a little on the drive home. Not from sadness, but from the relief of having someone outside the family see in her daughter what she saw. On the morning of March 15, 1988, Edna Kowalski came to the Marsh front door at 7:40 as she always did. Clara had already left for work. Lily opened the door herself, as she always did when Edna knocked, and she was dressed for school, coat buttoned, backpack on, and she had Pearl tucked under her arm. Edna later told investigators that Lily had said, very specifically, that she was going to let Pearl sit in her lap the whole way to school, because Pearl was cold. They walked together to the end of Fayette Street, then 2 blocks north to Jefferson, then east toward the school. At the corner of Jefferson and Maple, 1 block from the school, Edna stopped as she always did at the crosswalk, because she moved slowly, and Lily had learned to wait at that corner for the walk signal rather than test Edna's pace. Edna said she watched Lily step off the curb when the signal changed. She watched her reach the far side. She watched her turn and wave. She waved back. Lily Marsh never arrived at school. When Lily was not in her classroom at 8:30, Mrs. Halston marked her absent and continued her morning. At 1:45 in the afternoon, when Edna Kowalski arrived at the school for afternoon collection and was told Lily had been marked absent all day, she stood very still at the school office counter for a moment and then said she needed to use the telephone. She called Clara at the hospital. Clara left work immediately. At 2:23 in the afternoon, Clara Marsh walked into the Callaway Police Department and told the desk sergeant that her daughter had not arrived at school that morning and that no one had told her. The department assigned the case to Detective Louis Farr, a 17-year veteran of the Callaway force, who was 52 years old and had worked missing children cases twice before, both of which had resolved within 48 hours as runaways or family complications. He understood from the first hour of the Marsh case that this was different. Lily Marsh was 6 years old. She had been seen crossing a street 1 block from her school. She had never arrived. There was a 1-block gap in her documented morning, and whatever had happened in that gap. The investigation produced a single witness of significance in its first week. A man named Howard Peck, who lived on Maple Street and who had been shoveling the light snow from his front walk that morning, told investigators he had seen a dark blue van stopped at the curb on Maple Street between Jefferson and the school entrance at around the right time. He had not seen a child approach it. He had not seen the van move. He had noted it only because it was blocking part of the street in a way that made him aware of it, the way you become aware of something that is slightly wrong without being able to say exactly why. The van had no markings. He could not provide a license plate number. He could not describe the driver beyond saying he believed there was one. That single observation, a dark blue van on Maple Street, on the morning of March 15, 1988, was the only physical thread the investigation had to pull. Detective Farr followed it as far as it would go. A canvass of registered dark blue vans in Callaway and the 5 surrounding counties produced a list of 312 vehicles. Every one of them was checked against the owner's whereabouts on the morning of March 15th. None produced a lead that held up. The thread went nowhere. Lily's body was found on March 29, 1988, 14 days after she disappeared, in a drainage ditch along a state highway 9 miles south of Callaway. The medical examiner confirmed cause of death as asphyxiation. Detective Farr and the department exhausted every lead the physical evidence provided. A statewide canvass of dark blue vans produced hundreds of leads and no resolution. 3 suspects were identified through behavioral analysis, interviewed, and cleared. One man, whose name was never released, was held for questioning for 48 hours before his alibi was verified through employment records. Lily's case was worked actively through 1989 and sporadically into the early 1990s. It was never closed, but without new evidence, it slowed, and then it went quiet. Louis Farr retired in 1999. He was the 3rd detective to carry the Lily Marsh file. He did not stop carrying it when he retired. He maintained contact with Clara Marsh twice a year, called her on March 15th every year until he died in 2016, and told colleagues in his last years of service that the Marsh case was the one he was going to answer for if there was any answering to be done. He left the department with his personal case notes organized and labeled in a folder he donated to the Cold Case Archive the week before his retirement party. Clara Marsh had raised Lily in the north end of Callaway. After 1988, she stayed. People asked her sometimes over the years why she hadn't moved, why she kept living 2 blocks from Fayette Street, in a city where every corner had a memory attached to it. She told them that Lily had lived here. That was enough of a reason. She didn't elaborate, and most people who asked understood once they heard it that there was nothing more to say. By 1995, 7 years had passed. The memorial bench the school had installed in 1990 in the Jefferson Elementary courtyard had Lily's name on it and a carved brachiosaurus beneath it. The school's art teacher had done it at Clara's request, and Clara had stood in the courtyard on the day it was unveiled and not said a word. Mrs. Renee Halston, Lily's first-grade teacher, had transferred to another school but came back to Jefferson Elementary every March 15th to leave flowers at the bench, and she continued doing so for more than 2 decades, until her own health made the drive difficult. By 2000, 12 years had passed. Edna Kowalski died that year, at 83, having spent the last decade of her life doing what she told her pastor she needed to do, praying that whoever had taken Lily from the corner of Jefferson and Maple would be named before she was gone. She was not granted that. Her obituary in the Callaway Courier described her as a devoted neighbor and a woman of exceptional patience. Both things were true. By 2005, Clara Marsh was 48 years old and had become, over 17 years, one of the quietest advocates the Callaway cold case file had ever produced. Not loud, not public, just present. She wrote letters to the department every year, asking whether anything new had come in. She framed her letters carefully, not as accusations, not as grief performed for effect, but as the simple, documented correspondence of someone who expected to be taken seriously and intended to keep writing until she was. She never missed a March 15th. She never stopped counting. By 2010, 22 years had passed. Nora Vance had joined the Callaway Police Department in 2004 and had been assigned to the Cold Case Review Unit in 2011. She pulled the Lily Marsh file in her first month on the unit. She read every page of Louis Farr's documentation, every page of the 2 detectives before him, every supplement and follow-up and dead-end notation in the archive. She then called Clara Marsh, introduced herself, and told Clara that she had read the file. Clara asked her what she thought. Nora Vance said she thought the biological evidence preserved in 1988 had never been submitted for modern DNA analysis, and that it should be. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Lily. The biological evidence preserved by Detective Farr in 1988 had been maintained in the Callaway Police Department's evidence archive through 2 facility moves and a major reorganization in 2003, during which Farr, then still on the force, had personally overseen the transfer of the Marsh case materials to ensure nothing was lost or mislabeled in the transition. What Nora Vance submitted to the Pennsylvania State Police Forensic Laboratory in 2012 was a chain of custody that ran unbroken from March 1988 to the submission date. The lab confirmed the biological material was viable for modern DNA profiling. The Cody's comparison, run in 2013, returned no match. The person responsible had no prior criminal record requiring DNA collection. Detective Vance renewed the submission in 2019 with an expanded genetic genealogy protocol. The process, explained simply, works by identifying partial DNA matches to relatives of the unknown contributor in consumer ancestry databases, then tracing those matches through family tree records until they converge on a single individual. The genetic genealogy comparison ran through 2020 and into 2021 before returning a result in February of that year, a partial match pointing to a family cluster with roots in western Pennsylvania. The family name the genealogy analysis returned was Greer. Detective Vance cross-referenced the name against every record connected to the original 1988 investigation. Every interview log, every canvas form, every address noted in the case file. It did not appear. She then cross-referenced it against city directories for Callaway and the surrounding area in 1988. The name Greer appeared at 3 addresses. One of those addresses was on Maple Street, 1 block from Jefferson Elementary, 1 block from where Edna Kowalski had watched Lily Marsh wave goodbye. The man at that address in 1988 had been a 31-year-old construction worker named Dennis Greer. Detective Vance pulled his employment records from that period through Pennsylvania Labor Department archives. He had worked for a residential renovation company in Callaway between 1985 and 1991. The company's project logs, obtained through the state contractor licensing records, listed the addresses of jobs completed during that period. One of those addresses was on Fayette Street. The address was 1 door down from the Marsh family's row house. The project date was February 1988, 4 weeks before Lily Marsh disappeared. He had been working on Lily Street the month before she was taken. Vance pulled the original canvas records from the 1988 investigation. The door-to-door survey had covered Fayette Street and Jefferson Street. Maple Street, 1 block north, had been partially canvassed but not completely, a gap in the coverage that Farr's own notes flagged at the time as a resource limitation. Dennis Greer's Maple Street address had not been interviewed. He had not been identified as a person of interest in 1988. He had not been on anyone's list. Dennis Greer was 66 years old in 2021 and living in a suburb of Pittsburgh. He had worked steadily in construction management, married in 1994, divorced in 2003. He had no criminal record. He had been, in every available public account of his life, unremarkable. On a Thursday morning in March 2021, Detective Vance and 2 Pennsylvania State Police investigators drove to his home in the Pittsburgh suburb and knocked on his door. He answered in work clothes, a coffee mug in his hand. He looked at Detective Vance's badge. He looked at the 2 investigators behind her. He said nothing for what she later described as a very long moment. He was arrested that morning. The DNA evidence was confirmed through the laboratory comparison. The employment records placed him on Fayette Street in February 1988. The city directory placed him on Maple Street in March 1988, 1 block from where the van had been seen the morning Lily disappeared. The van registered to Dennis Greer in 1988, located through Pennsylvania DMV records from that year, was dark blue. The canvas gap from 1988, the partial coverage of Maple Street that FAR had flagged as a resource limitation, had left Dennis Greer unseen for 33 years. Dennis Greer was charged with first-degree murder. He entered a not guilty plea. Facing the DNA evidence, the vehicle records, and the employment documentation, he changed his plea in the fall of 2022 to guilty of third-degree murder. He was sentenced in January 2023 to 20 to 40 years in state prison. He was 68 years old at sentencing. And then, 9 months later, on a Tuesday morning in October 2023, a renovation crew broke through a section of plaster wall in a row house on Callaway's north side and found the doll. The row house on Chester Avenue had been built in 1921 and had changed hands 7 times since 1988. Its current owners were having the second floor renovated. When the crew opened the wall cavity and Paul Greer, no relation to Dennis Greer, found the cloth doll sitting upright between 2 studs. The forensic analysis that followed established 2 things. First, the wall had been sealed during a remodel, consistent with work performed in late 1988, months after Lily Marsh's death. Second, the doll was a cloth figure, 12 inches tall, dressed in a yellow pinafore, with a button face that matched the description of Pearl. The doll Lily had carried under her arm the morning Edna Kowalski walked her to the corner of Jefferson and Maple. The property records for Chester Avenue showed that in 1988, the row house had undergone interior renovation work. The contractor on that project was the same residential renovation company Dennis Greer had worked for between 1985 and 1991. His name appeared on the crew assignment log for that specific project, dated November 1988, 8 months after Lily Marsh's death. He had come back to the street where the family lived. He had sealed Pearl inside that wall himself. The Callaway District Attorney's Office used the doll discovery to file additional charges in December 2023. Dennis Greer's sentencing was reviewed, and the court increased his minimum term. He remains incarcerated. When Detective Vance called Clara Marsh to tell her about the doll, Clara was silent for a long time. She said finally that she had always wondered what happened to Pearl, because Lily never went anywhere without her, and that not knowing where Pearl was had been, in a way she found hard to explain, its own specific grief on top of everything else. She said she was glad Pearl had been found. She said she was glad he had kept her, because keeping her was what ended him. Lily Marsh had Pearl tucked under her arm on a cold March morning. She had facts about brachiosauruses she was still distributing to anyone who would listen. She was going to let Pearl sit in her lap the whole way to school because Pearl was cold. She waved from the far side of the crosswalk, and then she turned towards school, and she had done nothing. Nothing at all that should have ended at that corner. The people who loved her never stopped. Clara wrote letters for 35 years. Louis Farr called on March 15th every year until he died. Edna Kowalski prayed for an answer she didn't live to hear. Nora Vance read the file in her first month on the cold case unit and called Clara Marsh the same week. And Pearl, placed in the dark, carefully, upright, as if someone had made a decision about where to put her, waited in a wall cavity on Chester Avenue for 35 years until a crowbar found her. Some things refuse to stay buried. That is the only comfort this kind of story offers, and on most days, it is enough. Justice came for Lily Marsh after 35 years. She was 6 years old. Pearl is out of the wall. There are questions this case will not let go of. What does it tell us about a man that he kept the doll, that he went back to that street 8 months later, sealed it inside a wall he was working on, and preserved it rather than discarding it? Is that the behavior of guilt, of ownership, of something else that has no clean name? What would the 1988 investigation have looked like if the Maple Street canvas had been completed? If a resource limitation hadn't left one block unvisited? And what obligation do we have to the families affected by those gaps? And what does it mean that the final piece of evidence was not Dina or a database match, but a cloth doll in a yellow pinafore, sitting upright in the dark, waiting to be found? Justice found Lily Marsh after 35 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.